You're listening to Graveyard Show Classic. Podcast number 11, February 26th, 2009.
This is Christopher Sharrett. I teach film studies at Seton Hall University, and you're listening to The Graveyard Show.
Welcome to the Graveyard.
And welcome to another edition of the Graveyard Show podcast. I am your caretaker, and the graveyard is open. Today's guest is going to be Christopher Sharrett, who is the professor of film studies and communications at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. We're going to talk about film criticism and what that means when it relates to horror films. I'm sure there are probably some of you out there, when I say the word film critic, you immediately start thinking of Siskel and Ebert or Jeffrey Lyons or maybe Michael Medved, someone who is actually a film reviewer, someone who tells you whether or not you should see the movie or not see the movie, and they give you plot points and whether they liked it or not. That's not the case with a film critic, and Chris will get into this a lot better than I will, but essentially, a film critic is like someone who is writing a thesis. They look at a horror film, in this case, and they break down what the film is trying to say. I guess the best example would be George Romero. His zombie movies seem to have a commentary on society. So film critics would look at that, and then they would write a paper or write an article about the subject that they've decided to look at. In Dawn of the Dead's case, it was about capitalism and consumerism. So that's what film criticism is. And like I said, Chris will get into this a lot better than I will. If it's something that you've never listened to or studied, give it a shot. It's really interesting stuff. We're going to talk about the role of family in horror movies. We're going to talk about the original Halloween versus Rob Zombie's Halloween. We're going to get into that a little bit. And we're going to talk about some of the works that Chris has written, and also we'll get into a little bit about Dark Knight and Watchmen. More so about the Dark Knight, since it sort of brought film criticism back in the spotlight a little bit when it came out in mid-2008. Let's talk a little film criticism, shall we? It's time to go to school.
Christopher Sharrett is professor of communication and film studies at Seton Hall University in South Orange, New Jersey. He has published numerous articles on the horror film and other genres, and he is co-editor of the horror film critical anthology Planks of Reason, Essays on the Horror Film, which was published in 1984, and it was the first academic critical collection on the horror film. And Christopher Sharrett has been nice enough to join me on the Graveyard Show. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
So for those that are new to what a film critic is and what a film critic does, can you describe what the difference between a film critic and a film reviewer is?
Well, the basic distinction between a critic and a reviewer is that a critic is a person who analyzes in some depth versus a journalistic reviewer who basically gives a kind of a plot summary with a few general impressions. I think the concept of a critic has become lost because you don't really see them except in, you see them more in some online sites, and there are film journals like Film International and Cineast and Cine Action and a few others out there. But basically, the critic is a person who looks in some detail at a film to argue a point, whereas a reviewer, as I say, is a person who is working for a paper involved in telling people if they should see a film or not see it in a very short kind of summary sense.
Do you think that the film critic is kind of becoming like a lost art, sort of like the old journalist, the newspaper writer who kind of goes out on the beat and is pounding the pavement with his pencil, pen, and notepad in the back of his?
Right. Yeah. Well, you don't really see criticism in newspapers. I don't recall seeing it. I mean, there have been some journalistic critics like Pauline Kael, Andrew Saris of the Village Voice. Of course, Pauline Kael was with the New Yorker for many years. But they're pretty rare birds. What you see in the press are people who are involved in reviewing. And I think we'll continue to see them as long as there's some kind of reasonable facsimile of the newspaper, because people want to find out, what's playing at the local cinema and if they should see it or not. We don't. I think people have a distorted sense of criticism, since every reviewer tends to call himself or herself a critic, and the two terms are really kind of blurred. The two ideas of criticism and reviewing both have distinguished traditions in days gone by, but I think they've both been kind of distorted because of the demands for brevity and what's often called concision, which means writing in very short sentences and giving vague sorts of impressions. Yeah.
Well, it seemed like film criticism started to, within the last year, started to get a little bit more in the mainstream when The Dark Knight came out, because there was an argument that character of Batman, that towards the end of the film, what Batman's actions were in that film versus what the Bush administration has been doing. I'm curious, do you think that maybe at some point, if films start, especially mainstream movies, do you think that could ever cross the line where film criticism starts to create more mainstream discussions?
I don't think that criticism will ever become a fixation of the mainstream or an interest of the mainstream, actually, I'm sorry to say, because people have been taught not to have much interest in it. People tend to want to read short synopses, I mean, there are exceptions, and I think the internet may play a role in that, with many, online sites that go into some depth with a film, but those sites vary in quality, so it's a question of individual judgment there. The Dark Knight, there's been a lot of ballyhoo about that film, and I'm not a huge fan of it. I think it's a fairly formulaic superhero film. The question about the nature of power and whether Batman is a positive force or a negative force and so forth, that issue is kind of banal, and it's been brought up by comic books, for example, in the 1970s and 1980s. There's a film coming out, Watchmen, which I don't know about the quality of this film. Watchmen is a much more complicated work. I'm talking the actual
graphic novel.
Yeah, I really can't speak about the film yet because I haven't seen it. But that is a work that meditates on the role of the so-called hero, and many of the superhero comics and films have really been knockoffs of ideas that Alan Moore produced in Watchmen. So, but I mean, we have to wait for the films to come out to really study them.
Now, for anybody out there that might be interested in reading what film critics have written, maybe pursuing it, is there anyone, obviously Pauline Kael I guess, would be at the top of the list.
Not for me.
Not for you. Okay.
No, I
Who
was
would you
never-
recommend? Okay, then who would you recommend for anybody that's listening that may go, hey, you know what, I want to pursue this, whether it's horror movies or dramas or any particular genre, not just,
Well, the two people that I find to be models of critical writing, whether it be literature or film, would be Robin Wood,
Okay.
who is now a retired professor of film up at York University in Toronto. He lived in Britain for many years. He's a very pivotal figure in film studies. He's now in his late 70s, I would say. And also Andrew Britton,
Okay.
who it's Britton.
Okay.
He was also British, and he taught in Britain and Canada. And there is a book. It's actually a collection of his writing called Britain on Film, published by Wayne State University Press. Robin Wood has published many books on film, and he's written many articles published in various journals, primarily Cine Action, which is a British film I'm sorry, it's a Canadian film publication, which he's been part of for many years. If you read those two folks, and there are many others I could think of, sat down. I mean, there are all kinds of competent critics out there, scholars of film. But in terms of my favorites, certainly they rank high. In terms of their seriousness, in terms of the way that they approach what they study with a very focused and serious intent.
Okay.
And what they take on because they feel that the work is of some value. That's a central criteria, I think, for every critic.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, you were co-editor of the horror film critical anthology, Planks of Reason. Can you tell those listeners out there that aren't familiar with that what the book is about?
Well, the book came out in '84, and at that time, the sole editor and the brains behind the project was my friend Barry Keith Grant, and he put this idea together. We became friends at the time, and Barry had the idea of putting out an anthology of essays by people who were academics, who were interested in the genre. The genre, though very popular always, was seen as a kind of lowbrow genre for idiots or something worse, and there are all kinds of popular coffee table books and magazines and so forth on the horror film, but there really wasn't anything, as far as we could tell, that dealt with the genre seriously. And would be aimed at scholars. So he put out the first printing of that book, and then what was it now, about 8 years ago? I've kind of lost track of time.
Yeah.
We thought about updating it, and he said he wanted me to come on board because we had exchanged thoughts and shared the same sensibility, basically, about the horror film and other movies. So I became the co-editor of a updated version of that book, and we've added in some articles, and we've taken out some, and we've tried to kind of fine-tune it, a bit. So that book came out and published by Scarecrow Press. A little ad there, and I think even though there have been many other books on the horror film since the 1980s, I think that Planks of Reason has a historic, role.
What type of essays have been written that are included in that book? Just briefly, just so people have an idea.
Well, there are essays focusing on a lot of good films by people like George Romero and Tobe Hooper. I wrote a piece on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's a piece on Jaws. There's I'm kind of blanking now in my old age, but It covers the genre pretty thoroughly. It takes on representative samples of the genre. It includes a very pivotal piece called Introduction to the American Horror Film by Robin Wood, the person I just mentioned.
Okay.
That book contains a good sampling of intelligent writing on a horror film by one of the preeminent film critics and scholars. And there's also a new piece in it on the Japanese horror film. By one of our people, Ruth Goldberg.
Right, so there's a chock full of nuts in this book, and for those that, we'll get into that towards the end about how people can get it and where they can find it. It's interesting that you'd mentioned earlier that how fans of horror movies were thought of being as idiots or worse. I don't know if you're familiar with the AFI top 10 American genres that they had done, but American Film Institute, in their quest for categorizing everything, they went ahead and they did their top 10 American genres of all time, and horror movies weren't even on there. And it blows my mind because I sit here and I think, Universal was practically built on that, on their horror film, and yet Hitchcock is one of the great, horror/thriller directors of all time. Spielberg made one of the greatest horror movies of all time, if not the, and yet it's looked at as still, I think, in this light of it's like popcorn junk. What do you think about that?
Well, an idea that's deeply entrenched in our culture. I can recall as a child the notion that men don't look at horror films. They're only for idiots or for women. There's a kind of a gender bias there in an interesting way. But I can recall, just as a personal anecdote, being shuttled past a theater showing like the Mole People. Back in Philadelphia, when my old stomping grounds. When my dad said, "No, let's go and see this war movie or whatever." There are all kinds of ways of answering that question. My own view is that the horror film raises disturbing questions, not just at the level of, are there monsters really out there or not? But it raises questions about the nature of the evil other. And every genre, of course, has the other, whether it's the Indians in the Western or the gangster in the crime film and so forth. But in the horror film, you have the evil other designated as the monster, this horrendous thing. But there's a tradition in the best horror films of making the monsters sympathetic. By the way, there are other forms of the monster. This is something that Robin Wood points out in his pivotal piece on the introduction to the American horror film. That the monster can also be the female. We're also trained to think of other people overall as being the monster, as being the other, because after all, we're trained to compete with each other. Right. So the horror film has been seen, certainly by film scholars, after scholars started to take it on, as a fairly subversive genre. That it challenged the whole concept of the monster as something that had to be destroyed. I think the monster also does what many psychiatrists and psychologists who have approached it, critically, the overall genre critically, have suggested, which is that the monster represents the unconscious, the hidden desires of people that are really given free rein in the horror film. When the werewolf transforms, you see the unconscious mind coming out, and What's interesting is when fans of the horror film would watch it, the tendency was to kind of wait for the monster. Like, who cares what these cardboard normal people are doing, you know?
Yeah.
You want to wait for the monster, and part of that is the spectacle of it, you know? There's a spectacle in seeing the werewolf transform, you know, or the man transform into a werewolf, rather.
Yep.
Or to see the dinosaur or the, you know, Godzilla show up, or Frankenstein's monster show up, you know. But there's a sense that this evil other is more interesting than the normal world, and generally that's the case. I mean, there are all kinds of bad horror films, of course, just as there are bad war films and crime films and everything else, you know. But I think that that one of the reasons why the horror film is designated as cheesy or stupid or silly or whatever is it's because it at its best it poses some significant challenges. There have been times in Hollywood history when the horror film was seen as something close to pornography. You know, and it was as much a subject of the focus of the Hays Office, you know, the Hollywood Production Code Office, as any genre, you know, and I think that's kind of telling by itself.
What makes the horror film radical?
Well, pretty much, I think what I just said about the idea that at its best, it poses significant challenges. You know, I mean, if you look at the early Frankenstein films, the Frankenstein monster portrayed so beautifully by Boris Karloff, and one of the best acting performances of the American cinema. He is a martyr figure. He is a persecuted, sympathetic figure. James Whale wanted to emphasize the idea that he was a person of, a person, thing, a person, right?
Yeah.
A person of some dignity. Then you go down the line to a film like Psycho by Hitchcock, where the monster is the boy next door. And Hitchcock makes you eventually sympathize with him. You know, will he be caught or not? What is he really up to? What's happening? And as we find out who Norman actually is, even though it's terrifying and all that, I mean, there's still an element of sympathy. And then you have the films of George Romero, his wonderful zombie films, which were seen at first. Certainly, I think when he made his first film, Night of the Living Dead, as a wonderful parable of the 1960s, of Vietnam and of civil rights and the persecution of civil rights workers. He has said, I believe, that he was setting out to make a good, scary film on a low budget. However, I think in that film we see his intelligence showing through, whether consciously or otherwise. In the subsequent films, certainly in Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, Diary of the Dead, you know, you see a very deliberate attempt to use the horror film as allegory of the breakdown of American society.
Yeah, I kind of wonder. I've always wondered if he if he has confidence in humanity or not, based on his films, because you could kind of play it both ways. You can see it as this destructive society that falls apart, and yet there's usually seems to be that glimmer of hope somewhere.
Well, I think what he's a critic, in my view, he's a critic of an ideological system. He's a critic of patriarchy and of American capitalism. I think he has great compassion for human beings, which is something that you don't often see in films by filmmakers who I won't name at the moment, who take this snide attitude that the filmmaker is hipper and smarter than the subjects of his own work, and that human beings are basically suckers or jerks or what have you. George Romero is part of a tradition of filmmaking that is understanding and sympathetic toward humanity. I mean, recognizing the true monsters within humanity, and of course in his films it's the military, it's commercial interests, it's the mass media, it's the things that kind of demean people. But he's not a nihilist. I mean, some people say that his often apocalyptic films are basically nihilist, but I think he's really dealing with the crisis that people have made for themselves.
One of the subject matters that I find, it may not always be common in horror films because obviously there's so many of them, but speaking of Psycho, last week I had Ari Lehman on the show, who played the original Jason in the very first Friday the 13th, the little boy who jumps out of the lake at the end. And we were talking about, since the remake is out now and the originals are being re-released, but the theme of mother and monster, where you have Norman Bates in Psycho, you have Jason in Friday the 13th, and in Rob Zombie's new version of Halloween, he really plays on the mother-son theme. Is that something that you've come across as a common theme, or something that critics have looked at in terms of breaking it down?
Yeah, well, there is the idea of the terrible mother that shows up in the cinema. I think Hitchcock really pioneers it. You see it in films going back to the 1930s and 40s. But I think that Hitchcock is more a critic of the family structure. And in the case of Psycho, I think you could argue, even though Mother Bates plays a role in that, in deforming the psychology of Norman, that what's at issue there is the home, the homestead, the idea of the family, the concept of the couple. Don't forget that the first half of that film, dealing with Marion Crane and her dreams of having marriage and life with her boyfriend, and all of these romantic notions, that's as much a subject of Hitchcock's focus as the more extreme case of the second half of the film. The story of Norman Bates. Norman Bates is seen, I think, or can be seen as the culmination of Marion Crane. But some argue that there's too much emphasis placed on the evil or the cruel mother. What about the cruel father? After all, it is a male-dominated society. That's an issue, I think. But I think that in some of the better horror films, we get a good look at the nature of the family unit. How the family itself.
With Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with House of a Thousand Corpses, Hills of Eyes, Last House on the Left. I mean, you could go on and on.
Those films are really, or at least some of them, I think Chainsaw Massacre, the first one, is a very canny parody of the idea of the family that stays together and so forth. And there are other things to say about it, but it's a very interesting, I think, satire of the American frontier and family life, especially family life in a very degraded situation where the economic condition has made it barbaric. That's a suggestion anyway in Texas Chainsaw.
Now, of the modern day horror films, up until recently, where we've seen a lot of the 80s slashers being redone, mainly when you look at horror films prior to that, you see movies like Saw, which will be coming out with its sixth film this year, and they're talking about doing their seventh next year in 3D. So who knows if that's ever going to come to a close anytime soon. And Hostel and the torture porn movies, as they're being labeled. What do you think they're saying about this day and age?
Well, I think in general terms they're kind of representative of the taste for savagery that the culture has. But some of these films are kind of bewildering. Saw, you could see as a parody of the Bush years, in the sense that here is a guy who pretends to be this moralist, who is teaching his morals by torture and murder. Of course, some argue, well, he's not really a murderer, he's not really a serial killer, and so forth. But I think that series, well, like all franchises, I think it's wearing itself out as the producers want to really milk it, and it's making money, but it's made its point. And,
time to move on.
It's problematical, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the idea of the jigsaw killer as a inquisitor who is trying to teach the true meaning of life, the good old-fashioned values, by use of all kinds of torture devices and so forth, is emblematic of our times. Of course, the other side of it is that the people just want to go in to see, well, what kind of traps will he build next, and they want to find out what kind of dismemberment will we now see. And the Hostel films, there's a more, based on what the filmmakers say, there's a more conscious political intent in the idea of showing America as a predatory nation, with kids wanting to have fun at the expense of other people's suffering, misery. But then again, I mean, the question becomes, when we look at all the bloodshed, especially in Hostel 2, although it ends with a female castrating one of the bad guys, which is probably a novel take in the horror film, and maybe something needed, I don't know. But there's the question of whether the films are partaking of that which they pretend to criticize, whether or not the focus and the draw of the films is really the degree of bloodshed that we can see in a mainstream film. Because after all, there were all kinds of films, like the Faces of Death films and so forth, where you could see executions and so forth. But now we have, simulated, versions of murder, but in a very, graphic sense, and also, graphic killing in the case of the Hostel films, and also Saw, combined with a strong sadomasochistic sexual component too.
Very quickly, do you think that we're coming full circle now in terms of revisiting films, the slasher films from the 80s, sort of? I mean, they're very different in tone.
There's a strong emphasis, as you know, on the sequel, sequelitis, and also recycling product that did well in the past. Why not? I mean, if it did well 30 years ago, let's try it again. But let's do it in a more exaggerated way. Let's try to find a new twist. In the case of Rob Zombie's version of Halloween, which I find, pretty interesting. I think his first film, House of a Thousand Corpses, was pretty interesting, pretty fun in all kinds of ways, especially with Sid Haig there. But Halloween, I think, kind of pushes everything over the top but I think that his version of Halloween is more cohesive than the John Carpenter, because the John Carpenter starts off with an interesting psychological premise, the incestuous desires of a young boy for his sister, and showing us then the young boy, a child, as a killer. But then all that is dropped as we get this story of a psychiatrist tracking down the mad killer who is the incarnation of the devil, and the doctor, played by the great Donald Pleasance, is a kind of Captain Ahab figure, you know, for no good reason. What doctor would go tracking down his patient, for God's sake? But in you know, Rob Zombie's version, we do have an insistence on the way in which abuse of a child by a monstrously cruel family situation turns the child into someone who is very dangerous.
If people want to get your book, Planks of Reason, where can they find it?
Well, you can go onto the internet. That's the usual place where everybody goes. I mean, I'd rather people, you know, I'm a person who likes to go into bookstores and talk to people and order things.
Yeah.
But you could go into the
Those days are done.
You could go into the internet. I don't necessarily want to mention particular sites. There are some obvious sites that sell books and CDs, of course.
Very good.
Scarecrow Press, of course, is the publisher of the book, and that would be a source on the computer.
And do you have a website where you publish any of your work? So if people want to follow up,
I don't have a website of my own beyond where I'm located at Seton Hall University.
Great.
So I'm kind of in the Gutenberg age there.
Well, this is good, because if people want to hear more from you, they can either listen to the show, because we certainly want to have you back again many times, because there's so much we could talk about. I mean, it would take weeks to get through everything, or they can go to Seton Hall University and take one of your great film classes. Christopher Sharrett is my guest, and again, he is a professor of communications and film studies at Seton Hall University. Go out and get his book, Planks of Reason, Essays on the Horror Film. We will definitely have him back again. There's so much more to talk about. Chris, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you.
And as I put this interview to rest, I would like to once again thank Christopher Sharrett for joining me in the graveyard. His book that he co-edited, Planks of Reason, Essays on the Horror Film, was published by Scarecrow Press, and just do a search for it, and I'm sure you'll find it in any of your favorite internet shopping sites. And as you exit the graveyard, I would just like to remind you, as always, to please lock the gate behind you. We wouldn't want anyone to get out. Until next time.
This podcast is a proud member of the Horror Podcasting Network. www.horrorcasts.blogspot.com. In a world where zombies and humans coexist,
if it wasn't for the government, none of this would be happening. We'd all be wiped out, dead and gone, and that's the kind of world I'd rather be living in.
and clones are used for food.
The first time I saw myself being eaten, words cannot describe what was going through my mind.
One man will do the unthinkable
I'm going to help the next one escape.
and uncover a secret that will change our world forever.
That's insane. Why on earth would you want to do that?
The Zombie Chronicles, the first ever full-length podcast fiction novel by James Melzer.
Let me tell you something. When you see a 6-foot, 2-inch, 250-pound reanimated corpse come at you wearing nothing but a football helmet and his rotting schlong bouncing from side to side, you run.
Now casting at www.jamesmelzer.net.
Somewhere in the bottomless pit of my memory, the scream is still going.
Hurry, hurry.
Step right up. The most amazing
Tales appear
before your very eyes, gathered from the four
corners of
earth and brought here to you at 19
Nocturne Boulevard.
See the famous man-eating book of
Sumatra.
or a phantom direct from merry old England. Or aliens from beyond the stars.
Even such as these cannot withstand our platinum death ray.
Yes, our platinum death ray!
All these
And more spread out before you.
All
we ask is a moment of your
time. Spin the wheel.
And take a chance. Try your luck.
www.19nocturneboulevard.net